So as Toke was saying, this event is also the launching event of the Institute for Field Experiment, Institute for Behavioral Economics. And one of the co-founders and president of this institute is John List. John is not only a tremendously accomplished scholar, he's also one of the first economists, also considered as one of the founding fathers of field experiments. And John is also one of the first economists that really got out of the ivory tower of academia and started bringing science to society through partnership with governments, firms, and nonprofits. So John is the Kenneth Griffin Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago. John is also the chief economist of Lyft. Lyft is a ride-sharing company. Prior to that, John was the chief economist of Uber. Maybe here in Europe, we're more familiar with Uber than Lyft. And John in the past was also one of the members of President Obama Council of Economic Advisors. So John could not be here, but he left us a nice message. So we would like to share with all of you. Hopefully it's going to work.
In this workshop. I've been working with firms for over 20. Welcome everyone to the workshop. Thank you so much for joining us on this scientific pursuit. Now, I very much wish I could be there for the workshop, but alas, I'm here in America and the timing just doesn't work. Now, fundamentally, I believe that the business of business is science. And because of that, I think you are in great hands in this workshop. I've been working with firms for over 25 years now, and I've found the experimental method to be quite attractive to learn foundational issues in the organization. Now, you can use the experimental method in a variety of ways, from thinking about optimal wage contracts, to thinking about what is the best way to approach the customer base, to think about optimal ways to segment customers. So really all across both the demand and supply sides, the experimental method can be quite useful. Now, it's useful because it allows you to measure causal relationships within your data. Yet the job isn't done after you measure those causal relationships. That's because determining the whys behind those causal relationships or underlying those causal relationships is fundamentally important. You will be able to unlock deep mysteries and really what I call the gold within your organization if you can figure out the whys behind these interrelationships. In that way, I wish you much luck, and I look forward to working with you in the future. And have a great workshop. Bye-bye.
All right. Perfect. So can everybody still hear us at home? Just double checking. Okay, perfect. All right. So what I'm gonna briefly talk for the next 30 or so minutes, I want to do 4 things. First, I want to give a brief overview of what behavioral economics is. Then I want to explain sort of in a few words what experiments are. Why do we do experiments? What do we need experiments? I want then to give you a few examples of why experiments are valuable tools within organizations. I will go over a few examples of experiments that have been run in partnership with organizations. And then I'm going to conclude saying a few words about the Institute for Behavioral Economics. Now, first things first, what is behavioral economics? Now, to answer this question, we first need to ask ourselves, what is economics? Economics is the study of how people allocate scarce resources among competing needs. Every time we have to decide whether to buy a car, invest in our education, maybe decide how much to save for retirement, or even choose who we're going to marry. We're all the time making decisions that involve scarce resources that need to be allocated among competing needs. Now, of course, if these decisions were left to fate or destiny, economics would not exist. Luckily for us, these decisions are not random. So in that sense, economics is a science. We can predict. How can we predict? Well, the way we people behave depends on two things that can be predicted. The preferences that people have, what do people like, and the constraints that people face. What do people can do? Now, to study economic decisions, then we need three key ingredients. First, we need to know what people prefer. What do people care about? Two, we need to know what constraints people face. And three, we need to know how those decisions happen in practice. We don't live in an abstract world, we live in a real world. So I'm going to walk you through some of the differences between the classic approach that economics has taken to study decision making and show you how behavioral economics expands that approach. And I'm going to do it through these 3 points. The first point is, what do people care about? The classic approach when it comes to economic decisions and when it comes to what do people care is to think that people care about financial incentives. Economic decisions are about wealth and money. So traditionally, we think that people try to maximize their income, their wealth. Now, behavioral economists do acknowledge, of course, that financial incentives are a critical piece of what people care about, but people care about a lot of other things. People have preferences over some non-financial incentives. We all care about social image. We all care about seeking pride and avoiding shame. We care about what others think of us. We think about ourselves. Self-image is an important thing that drives our decisions. We want to keep a positive view of ourselves, and that translates into the decisions we take. We want to keep an optimistic view of life. So the way we select information and the way we make decisions sometimes is done to maintain an optimistic outset about the future. We care about warm glow. We care about how our decisions make us feel good people. We care about others. We care about altruism. We care about our children, our friends. We care about our country. We care about fairness. We want to make sure that the outcomes of our decisions are fair. And sometimes we care about equity. Now, what constraints do people face when they try to make the best they can to obtain those things? Now, the traditional view is to think that the constraints that individuals face when they make economic decisions are essentially two: how much money they have and how much time they have. Of course, behavioral economics does acknowledge that these are two critical points, but in the recent years, we have realized that the constraints that people face are much wider. People not only have constraints in terms of the money they have and the time they have at their disposal, but people face constraints in the level of attention they have. We don't have infinite attention, so sometimes we miss stuff. Sometimes we miss it out of a mistake. Sometimes we intentionally do not pay attention to stuff. Our willpower is limited. If you ever woke up in the middle of the night craving a chocolate bar, well, that's willpower, and it's a scarce resource. Information is scarce. We don't know everything about everything. And sometimes acquiring information is costly. And experience is a fundamental limit we experience. Some people have more experience with some decisions, and as you gain experience, you get better at making those decisions. But that amount of experience is a limited resource. Now, how do people make decisions in practice? The classic approach is to assume that individuals make the best use of the stuff they have at their disposal. The classic approach is to assume that all information that is relevant to a decision problem is taken into account. The classic approach assumes that everything that is irrelevant to that decision is ignored. The traditional approach is to assume that emotions don't play a role. And finally, that the way the problem is framed, it doesn't affect how we decide. That's where behavioral economics perhaps diverges the most from the classic approach, because behavioral economists assume and model that sometimes stuff that is important is ignored. Sometimes stuff that is not important is for some reason taken into account through our decisions. We all know by introspection that emotions play a big role in our decisions. If we're angry or if we're very emotional, we're probably going to take a very different decision than when we're calm, quiet, and ponderative. And finally, of course, the way a problem is framed is going to affect how we make decisions. Let me walk you through a very simple and to some extent silly example. Let's talk about neoclassical George. So George is a guy that receives in his mail an invitation to apply for a very exclusive credit cards. So in Europe, you may not know what American Express Black is, but the Black American Express is a very exclusive credit card, a very expensive one, that comes with a lot of benefits, but also a lot of costs. Not everyone can afford an American Amex Black. So how does our neoclassical George walks through the problem of deciding whether to apply for that credit card? So first, George will carefully read the letter. George will carefully read through all the costs and benefits connected to that credit card. Then George will ask himself to what extent he needs a new line of credit. Does he really need extra credit for his life? Then George is a forward-looking thinker. So he will think about possible repayment plans. Of course, credit cards being debt, how is he going to repay over time that debt? Then George will compare the offer with other offers. It will see what other credit cards have to offer. And then finally, George will decide to apply if the benefits of having these new credit cards will outweigh the costs. Now we have behavioral George. What does behavioral George do? Well, first, behavioral George just glances at the letter. Second, behavioral George most likely will get really fixated on some of the benefits or costs and will completely ignore others. Something that is very common in the US is that when you pay with credit card, you get cash back. Some percentage of your purchase come back to your account. George perhaps is going to really fixate on that. It will say, wow, every time I pay, I get 2% back in cash. But maybe George will ignore some other significant sources of cost for that credit card. Then George will think, I'm going to be a good guy, and I'm going to be very wise in the way I use my credit card. A few seconds later, George suddenly realizes, wow, I really need that new Mercedes. Then George will wonder to what extent having this exclusive credit card will affect the perception that his friends have. Will George look cool to his friends because he has an exclusive credit card? How does George end this process? Well, George will realize that the credit card offers some online banking and will decide to apply based on that. Spoiler alert, most credit cards do have online banking, right? So George is facing transaction costs. Deciding is costly. Giving time to make decisions is costly. George is facing some attention constraints. It's not easy to pay attention to every single detail. George faces some time inconsistency. His present self is going to probably make decisions that are very different from his future self. And of course, George faces some willpower constraints. He really wants his future self not to buy that Mercedes, but probably when the time comes, is going to fall prey of lack of willpower and probably spend too much. George doesn't want the credit card only for the costs and benefits that are connected to the credit card, but George cares about the image value, the status value of that credit card. I'm going to give you one example of one experiment in a few slides. Finally, George takes into account into his decision process things that are irrelevant to this decision at hand. Okay, so that sounds like a big mess, right? Sounds like a problem that cannot be approached, but this is the beauty of economics. Economics is the art and science of disciplining complexity. We know that people economic choices are influenced by different motives, but we can model these motives and we can quantify the relative importance of different things, of these different motives into the decision process. So we can weight, model, and evaluate to what extent George's decision is guided more by cost consideration or by social image considerations. So we know that people make mistakes, but these mistakes, most of the times, are not completely random, but they're systematic. We make mistakes in very systematic ways. Why is this important? Well, because we can model, predict, and quantify the relative importance of those mistakes. And three, we know that the context affects decisions. The way problems are framed is going to affect the way we decide, but the way context affects decisions oftentimes is systematic. We are affected by framing in systematic ways. Why is systematic so important? Well, because if things are systematic, we can model that framing effect and we can quantify how much it influences our decisions. Now, really, behavioral economics and economics in general is about disciplining complexity, putting forth testable hypotheses about behavior that are disciplined by economic theory. Now, once we have a nice set of hypotheses of how and why people behave in certain ways, we need to test them. How do we do it? Well, through experiments. We measure complexity by running what is called economic experiments. And to explain what economic experiments are, let's take a step back and think about what medical experiments are. What is a medical experiment? In a medical experiment, people are divided in control and treatment groups. Now, you can think about a new vaccine or a new drug. What does happen? Well, scientists randomly assign individuals to either receive a placebo pill or the actual drug. Why did I underline randomly assigned? Because the key to establish causal effects is to randomize individuals into treatment and control. If you let people select into whatever they prefer, whatever effect are you going to find of, for instance, of the drug is mostly going to be driven by the effect of selection. Imagine there's a new drug on the market, let's say a vaccine for COVID, and you open the floor for anyone who wants to take it, to take it. Now imagine that only hypochondriacs decide to sign up for the test. What's going to happen? Well, the test is going to show that the vaccine is really effective, but perhaps the vaccine is not effective because it works, but it perhaps is effective because hypochondriacs are very careful, so they don't contract the virus to begin with. So what do we do as experimenters? We don't give drugs to people, but what do? We do apply the same scientific method, but what we randomize people into is in different behavioral interventions. We give people different incentives, and we give people different framings of the same problem. Why do we do this? Because through this approach, we are able to establish the causal effect of whatever we're changing on behavior. Now, we can experiment with a bunch of things. Really, this is one of the cases where your imagination is the limit. Here are some examples. We can, economists routinely change financial incentives. So for instance, you randomly vary the price that are offered to different consumers. We change some non-financial incentives. So for instance, we can vary some symbolic awards that we give to employees to try to see to what extent symbolic awards affect productivity or happiness of employees. We can change the framing. We can modify just one sentence, and I'm going to give you one example, in a letter and see how that affects decisions. We can change the amount of information we give to people. We can change the social visibility of decisions. We can turn on and off to what extent others can see the type of decisions that we make. And you're going to see through the course of the day many other examples in which, in very simple ways, you can learn about people's decision by making small changes. Now, I want to give you 3 examples of 3 actual research papers that I think provide a good sense of to what extent these kind of methods are valuable to organizations. I'm going to give you one example of an experiment that was run with a large Indonesian bank, one of the biggest banks in Indonesia. I'm going to give you one example run with the UK Department of Treasury. And then I'm going to conclude with one example of an experiment run within one of the largest nonprofits in the United States. The first experiment is about status. Now, of course, when the Indonesian bank and researchers came together, they had different goals. What did the bank want to do? The bank wanted to capitalize on the expanding upper middle class in Indonesia and essentially increase consumption of those individuals that have high wealth capacity. How was the bank planning to do that? Well, by offering a new expensive credit card. Remember the example of the Amex card? Now, of course, researchers don't care directly or per se about increasing profits of the bank, but researchers in this case, and Leo Burstyn is, by the way, one of our advisory, is on our advisory board for the Institute for Behavioral Economics. The researchers were interested in quantifying the economic value of status. If you go back to the example of George, George buys the card for many reasons. One reason might be the benefits that are attached to the card, but it might be that George purchases the card because of the status the card gives. So for the bank, it is important to quantify to what extent people purchase their product out of status or out of benefits. Why? Because giving benefits is expensive, right? The more benefits you connect to the card, the more it's costing to the bank. But if it turns out that these benefits are not the main driver of behavior, well, then maybe you can take some of these benefits away. So here's the experiment they run. They run 2 experiments. In the first experiment, some existing customers were offered a new card, a platinum card. This card was framed as an exclusive card that had some benefits attached to it. Now, if we want to isolate the effect of benefits from the effect of status, we need another treatment. We need in some way to separate the effect of the card bringing benefits from the effect of the card bringing status, this nice platinum card. So how do they do it? They randomly assigned some existing customer to sign up for a new card and randomly assigned other customers to a control product which had identical benefits from the platinum card, but no status attached. What does it mean in practice? Well, in practice, what they did is to offer an upgrade on their current card. Okay, so people that were in treatment 2, they were told you can sign up and your card can be upgraded to with all the benefits, and the benefits were the same of the platinum card. Okay, so in this way, the researchers are able to separate the effect of status from the effect of the benefits. What is the outcome variable experimenters are going to look at in this experiment? Sign-up rates. How many people respond to the offer? Now, the researchers who are careful realize one important thing about status. Status is a positional good. If we make something less exclusive, well, if people buy into that product because of exclusivity, they're going to attribute less value to that product because now more people will have it. So what did they do? After some time, they went back to the group of people who got the platinum card, and they further ran a second experiment. Among this group of platinum card holders, they offered another card, even better, a diamond card. And they randomized, however, one little piece of information. Some of these platinum cards, people who upgraded to the platinum cards, were just offered the diamond card, period. And others were offered the diamond cards and told, by the way, you have the platinum card now, but we have changed the criteria for letting people into the platinum program. And we have lowered the amount of income that you must have in order to apply for the platinum. What does this convey to consumers? It's conveyed to consumers that the platinum card all of a sudden is less exclusive. What did the researchers find? So on the left-hand side, you see the first experiment. You see that the platinum, the credit card, the platinum take-up was much higher when people were offered the platinum card compared to the case where people were offered a similar product that had exactly the same benefit, but no status. So if you look at the difference between the blue bar and the orange bar, that is the effect of status, okay? That difference tells us to what extent the value that people attach to that card is benefits, to what extent is status. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see the second experiment. How many people took up, how many platinum card holders decided to make an even higher upgrade and get the diamond card? As you can see, the amount of people who take up the card nearly doubles when people learn that the current card they have has become less exclusive. What is the lesson for the firm? First, economists have learned something really important about the role of status. Status goods have been around. We have theorized about status goods, but this is the first empirical test of the existence and quantifying the status goods. Why is this important for the firm? Because now the firm has learned ways to expand its customer base, but knowing that there are always unintended consequences in using status. You can increase the amount of people who buy into an expensive product, but that comes at a cost of some people that are left behind that now will value products in the tier below a little bit less. Here's another example. We're moving in the world of taxes. This is an experiment about framing. Remember we discussed that the way things are framed affect decisions? Well, this experiment is precisely about that. The UK government in this experiment had a very concrete problem. There were some people who were supposed to pay taxes that didn't. These people received a number of solicitations reminding them they had outstanding debt, but no response. So the UK government partnered with researchers. One of the co-authors is John on this paper. And researchers were interested in learning about the role of framing, that we see is very important. So what did they do in this experiment? In this experiment, they did something incredibly simple. They had a control group. So some of these debtors, they sent out a letter, business as usual, reminding people, look, according to our records, you have some outstanding debt, please pay. In the second treatment, they added one sentence, and I'm going to read it aloud. They added the following sentence. Previously, we treated your lack of response as an oversight. Now, if you don't call this phone number, we will treat this as an active choice. Why is this important? This is changing the framing, the perception that these taxpayers have about how the government thinks about their oversight. In control letters, people could tell themselves, well, I have a plausible excuse. I may have forgotten. And maybe the UK government will think, well, maybe that's most likely what happened. But now that the government in the treatment letter is explicitly saying, I'm not going to treat that as an act of omission, but I'm going to treat it as an act of commission. I will assume that if you continue not paying, now that I'm telling you, I will consider that you're doing it actively. You didn't forget, you intentionally decided not to pay. What are the results? So in the control treatment, about 12% of people who got this letter repaid their debt within 30 days. What happens in the treatment group? That percentage nearly doubles. 23% of individuals who receive the omission commission framing do repay their debt. Now, the size of these apparently simple treatment, one line in a letter, is big. $1.8 million collected just by changing one sentence. The third example I want to give you is about social recognition. In this experiment, the researchers, the US charity was interested in doing something very simple, expanding participation into their programs. This is the fourth largest charity in the US. So the charity was thinking about ways in which increasing participation. What did researchers were interested in? Well, researchers were interested in quantify the costs and benefits of using social recognition to change behavior. Nowadays, through governments and firms, we see that more and more often we are nudged or encouraged to take decisions not by offering us money, but by making our behavior visible. We know that social visibility is something very important for people, and governments and firms have long understood that we can leverage that desire for positive recognition to achieve socially desirable behaviors. Now, the researchers were interested in to what extent this generates benefits for people who enjoy pride, but to what extent these kind of interventions generate shame. Not everyone can be at the top. If you look good, that means that someone else doesn't look as good as you. So what did they do in this experiment? This charity has gym members. This charity is the YMCA of the United States. And gym members could, in this experiment, sign up to a program that would donate $2 to charity for every day these gym members who sign up go to the gym for 1 month. So if you're a member of the YMCA, you sign up to this program and you can give to charity. 2 treatments. 1, participants knew that their decisions were hidden from others. And 2, they knew that at the end of this program, how many times they went to the gym and consequently how much charity that generated would be visible to others. What the experimenters did in this experiment is before at the sign-up stage, they used a method to quantify to what extent people are willing to pay to avoid being seen and to what extent people are willing to pay to be seen. So their monetary value for anonymity or visibility. What do they find? They find that public recognition does indeed work. People who know that their behavior will be exposed go to the gym, participate about 17% more. The researchers found that people are willing to pay both to hide low performance, but they're also willing to pay to show good performance. When we sum these things up, though, what the researchers find is that social recognition in this context is a negative sum game. The costs incurred by those who feel shamed are outweighed the benefits of those who experience pride. So the message is that, yes, social recognition works, but perhaps there's a less socially efficient way to change behavior compared to more traditional tools that we have, like financial incentives. Now, in the last minute or so, I want to say a few words about the Institute for Behavioral Economics. As we said, this is the launching event of this initiative. This initiative stems from 2 initiatives that were launched by John List in the United States and me. One is the Science of Philanthropy Initiative, which was and is an initiative meant to bring together nonprofits and researchers to understand the underpinning of charitable behavior. And the Summer Institute for Field Experiment. You can read more on our website. So what is the goal of this institute? The goal is to create a network of scholars and organizations that is designed to support organizations' decisions through science. Firms and scholars come together identify questions and challenges that are relevant for both their business, but they're interesting also for academics. Then what happens? Well, researchers go out and implement experiments addressing the question, why would the experimenter do that? Because they want to publish. We don't care about money, we care about publications. What do firms care about? Well, receiving insights from science. And that's exactly what firms receive. Now, firms, of course, care about competitiveness. Firms care about improving their managerial practices. Firms care about nurturing talent, making the best use of data and technology. And of course, sometimes being socially responsible firms. Researchers care about something else. Researchers care about science. They care about publishing. They care about expanding our understanding of markets, human behavior. But there is an intersection between these 2 worlds, and it's exactly where the Institute wants to play a role. So if you want to learn more, you can go on behavioraleconomics.org. There's a section that allows you to join the newsletter, and there are going to be more and more events coming up in the following months, but you can have more information there. So I went a few minutes over time, so I got to pause here And thank you all very much for sticking with us. We're going to have a short break, a few minutes break, and then we're going to come back at 10:50.